What happened to the 239 souls on board Malaysia Air Flight 370? Disappeared in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and all we have are guesses as to why. But it wasn't the first time the free world had been shocked by a plane disappearing at sea. In 1972, a 6-seat prop disappeared. You may be wondering how 6 seats could compare to 239 souls. It's a good question. The answer is simple but complicated. Whatever else you say about it, it's also tragic. You can't stake a cross into the Pacific. There's no closure when the bodies are missing. Amelia Earhart's down there too. A few thousand tons of salt water interring her in her twin-engine tomb. There's a long and sordid history of aircraft being swallowed whole by the deep. Ever since Lindbergh, people have launched across ponds to never be heard from again. Mysteries inflame the imagination. Some people think Earhart settled down on some nice tropical island somewhere. Others think she was taken captive by Japan. Roosevelt dispatched to Lexington in a futile search to find the famed aviator. Earhart got an aircraft carrier. When November 1812 went missing, there were a couple of congressmen on board. What do you think they got? It's a nice thought that everyone is equal. Politicians bloviate on it until they're blue in the face. They need your vote, so they tell the tall tale that they think you matter as much as they do. Ask them to put their money where their mouth is and you'll discover the truth. If you ever disappear over Prince William Sound, don't expect a multi-agency search for your remains. If they find you and the water is deep, they'll leave you there, unless you have a famous last name. They'll give the coordinates to your loved ones. If they have the means, they can rent a boat and drop a few petals over your bones. 5.5 weeks. If you've been elected to Congress, that's how long they're going to search for you. And it's going to be intense. The Air Force, Army, Coast Guard, and a few others will blow their budget on an all-out to find the scene of the crash. Ask the President, and he'll lean on the Air Force to send an SR-71 with 10,000 feet of film to spy out the Alaskan wilderness. The widows will waste sleepless nights hoping that a glint of wrecked metal will lead to a miraculous rescue. In their quiet moments, they'll settle for a body to put in the coffin. Beggars and kings, when it's all said and done, we end up in the same place. Even the powerful are lost at sea. We're not as sophisticated as we think. The grave laughs at our hubris. When a couple of congressmen disappear over the tundra, there's going to be some rumors. A bomb, a terrorist attack, a mob hit. There's even bound to be some evidence to support it. Anytime anything happens, there are 1,000 little details that accompany it. It's always possible to line a few of them up into a conspiracy. Powerful men succumbing to a little frozen water is so droll. A wife knocking off her husband is so much more captivating. A fueler on the ground was one of the final witnesses to the affair. He testified that nothing was placed aboard the aircraft except gasoline. It's an odd note for the NTSB to append to the final report. Buried in it is an ominous implication. Another witness testified to only seeing a small amount of passengers' baggage loaded aboard the airplane. The NTSB was clearly fixated on the objects that were loaded on the twin piston. It wasn't because of weight. There were 5 occupants in the 6-seat aircraft and not a whole lot of luggage. To understand the implication, you must jump forward a few years when Alaska Congressman Nick Begich's widow, Peggie, married a leg breaker from Tucson named Jerry Paisley. According to her, he was a bartender at the time for a hotel in Anchorage. It was a whirlwind romance that led to a shotgun wedding that lasted almost as long as the ceremony did. It didn't take long for Peggie to spot some violent tendencies in Paisley and move on. She gave him the boot but had already lost her survivor benefits. The former congressman's wife wound up taking menial jobs to keep food on the table for her 6 kids. This would make the later accusations sting. You need to know something else, too. The other congressman in the chartered airplane was House Majority Leader Hale Boggs. He had served on the Warren Commission. Among other things, they had investigated whether the mob had anything to do with the JFK assassination. This seemed like an irrelevant tidbit for decades. Then, in 1974, Peggie Begich's ex-leg-breaker husband was convicted of murder. And then there's this strange diversion. An ominous note was sent to Peggie claiming responsibility for her husband's disappearance not long after the fateful flight. It included cutout magazine letters glued to a piece of paper. The author claimed to be a Yugoslavian nationalist angry at Nick Begich's Croatian ethnicity. At the time, there was quite a bit of violence between the two ethnic groups. The FBI traveled to 8 cities chasing down the lead. Nothing came of it. High-profile cases bring out the crazies. Fast forward to 1994, and it was clear that Jerry Paisley was going to die in prison. 2 counts of murder with kidnapping on top. He needed an ace in the hole, so he contacted the FBI from Pima County Jail. He told them that he had information about the missing airplane. He said that he had taken a bag up to Alaska about the size of a bomb just before the flight. If you read the transcript, he spends a lot of time equivocating. Maybe he knows something, maybe he doesn't. He's locked up for life, maybe he can cut a deal. At the very least, the interview would have been a break to his jailhouse tedium. Jerry's main claim to fame was rubbing shoulders with a semi-retired mob boss named Joseph Bonanno. The Don had been chased out of New York City during the Banana War. He went west to Arizona, settling in Tucson. He was the inspiration for Don Corleone in the movie The Godfather. Believe it or not, he lived a block from me when I was 1. Such is the fickle nature of coincidences. Jerry claimed that he had first met Peggie when he drove her to the Don in 1972. He said that it was soon after this that he had been told to fly the mysterious bag up to Alaska. Supporting the intrigue were surreptitious pictures the FBI took 2 decades prior of Peggie and Jerry's wedding in Tucson. The reception hosted an odd assortment of civil servants and mobsters. There was even a judge and an ex-cop. It was the early 70s. Powerful people ran with other powerful people. Nose around in JFK's life long enough and you'll find some shady dudes. Jerry had plausibility but was probably full of it. He couldn't account for how a congressman's wife from Alaska would have gotten mixed up with a semi-retired mob boss who had been run out of New York. And he couldn't offer any corroborating evidence. The testimony of a twice-convicted murderer doesn't go very far. One thing his story had going for it was that the wedding had been in Tucson. Peggie had, indeed, been to the city at least once. She claimed to have met him while he was bartending in Anchorage, so he wasn't lying when he said that he had been to Alaska. If you're wondering how it came to be that Jerry and Peggie met 2,000 miles from Paisley's hometown of Tucson, it was 1974. Dodging an investigation into a crime could be accomplished by driving through Canada. Let things cool off. Drive back and marry a former congressman's rebounding widow. It makes more sense than Joe Bonanno whacking a congressman from Alaska after having dinner with his wife. Later, after Jerry finally met his maker, one of Nick and Peggie's 6 children would call her supposed pre-tragedy trip to Tucson an absurdity. Peggie was the sole caregiver to the children at the time. She couldn't very well hop away for a few days to plot murder with Bonanno. For all the ominous references regarding what was placed aboard the aircraft, the NTSB was getting at something much more benign. Hampering the ability to find the plane was the apparent absence of an emergency locating transmitter. In 1972, ELTs were not required under federal regulations. Alaska had their own rules, though. The state required an ELT to be aboard all civil aircraft. There was a good reason for this. Lots of planes go missing in Alaska. If an ELT had been on board, crash forces would have generated a signal for rescuers to track. The NTSB was able to determine that the aircraft in question didn't have a permanent ELT installed, but pilot Don Jonz owned a portable one. When filing a VFR flight plan 9 minutes after departing Anchorage, a flight service station radio operator asked if he had emergency gear and a locator beacon on board. Jonz replied, "Affirmative." Witness testimony varied on the subject. It remains unclear if Jonz brought along the ELT for the charter flight. If he did, something clearly prevented it from working. If you figure it might have been an explosion, you have to understand that ELTs are designed to survive a plane crash. When you think of Jonz, you probably think of the traditional spelling. Don wasn't a big fan of the boring version that was on his birth certificate. He changed his surname to Jonz. Felt it was more distinctive. There's an awful lot about Don that's wrapped up in that one little tidbit. He was a maverick. He was also the owner and chief pilot of the charter company, and he was a highly experienced bush pilot. While we're talking about coincidences, Jonz wrote an article about flying in icing conditions a few weeks prior to the fateful flight. It was published in Flying Magazine days after the disappearance. There was a seeming indifference towards the dangers of ice that was on display in his article. He would write, "If you don't like ice, stay the hell out of IFR." It's a good line if a little obtuse. There were some better ones. Some were even downright useful. In the ice, fly fast. Don't be afraid. Sometimes you have to climb higher to find warmer air. He had learned a thing or two over the tundra. Here's where I normally say it could happen to anyone, but Don Jonz wasn't anyone. He was a force of personality. Guys like him either power through obstacles unscathed or they disappear into the wild with a couple of congressmen in tow. Maybe that's not fair. Or maybe you could see it coming a mile away. I wish I had known Don. Shake his hand or spit in his eye, you're going to have a story to tell. There are a few things that bush pilots learn to deal with in Alaska. Aging airframes beaten to hell by harsh weather, unpressurized cabins against mountain terrain, and inadvertent encounters with low visibility and clouds. Someday a slick-back Fed from D.C. is going to find himself in Anchorage. He's going to wonder at the imbalance between instrument time logged by the bush pilots and all those visual-only flight plans. Don certainly wasn't the first to file VFR into questionable weather. And you have to be fair to him. He knew that he was flying a couple of big shots. It's a tough spot to tell them that neither you nor your aircraft are good enough to get them where they want to go. Going VFR between Anchorage and Juneau requires transiting through Portage Pass. A weather briefer told Jonz that Portage was closed both prior to the flight and after he was airborne. Mountainous terrain resulted in minimum instrument altitudes above 7,000 feet. Moderate rime ice was forecast between 6,000 and 14,000 feet. The twin piston that Jonz was flying was not certified for flight into known icing. It did not have de-ice boots, which was apparently just fine by Jonz. In his posthumous Flying Magazine article, he had listed de-ice boots as the least important piece of equipment when encountering ice. Here is a word-for-word quote. "Personally, I find them a pain and ineffective, but some pilots seem to like them." For what it's worth, the thermometer and heated pitot were his no-go items for flight into ice. De-ice boots were not. Again, you have to be fair to Jonz here. De-ice boots actually are a pain, and they are certainly less effective than the heated leading edges found on jets. And he also points out that no aircraft, regardless of installed ice equipment, can fly around in ice indefinitely without danger. You also have to give Jonz some slack for his bravado. Flying up here is no joke. It wasn't just ice. An Air Force helicopter had turned back from the same route due to severe turbulence. Jonz was most likely unaware of this, but you could imagine getting hammered down low in the clear with a couple of puking leaders of the free world. The temptation to climb into the muck in order to get out of the bumps had to be substantial. The aircraft was overdue by 45 minutes when the Air Force got the first call about it. They spent half an hour calling around airports in the area to see if the aircraft had diverted. No joy. They launched the first of the search and rescue operations. Eventually, over 1,000 sorties would be conducted. 3,600 hours were logged. 325,000 square miles were covered. Alaska is vast. There are a ton of places to get lost. Without wreckage to study, the NTSB did not provide a probable cause. They simply noted that conditions along the route were not conducive for VFR flight. A good theory emerged that the aircraft iced up and spun into Prince William Sound. That would explain why the wreckage was never found. One of the great things about aviation is also one of the worst. It doesn't matter who you are, a working bush pilot or a congressional leader. In the air, everyone's equal. Up here, even a king can succumb to a little bit of ice.